I don't think I've done a video about this particular item, so I had the chance now and decided to just go ahead and do it. So what we have here, as you can very clearly perceive, is a pocket watch. I picked this up at my local flea market 7 years ago as a birthday present for myself, and it has been one of my most prized possessions ever since. I just got this back from my watchmaker about a week ago, and he did a wonderful job of restoring this and fixing it, and I cannot thank him enough. So yeah, what's the deal with this watch? This is a railroad chronometer pocket watch. This particular model is a Swiss manufactured Ball model 435 from about 1950. And this particular model was the last model of pocket watch certified for use on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. If I zoom in, you should be able to read where it says Ball Official Railroad Standard, Cleveland. I know that this model of watch was used on the Canadian Pacific Railroad for two reasons. One, I have actually looked up the records myself and I've seen it listed there. And two, because of a feature on the watch itself. If you look really close, you'll see the outer ring of numbers from 1 to 12, and then the inner ring of numbers from 13 to 24. That means that this watch has a 24-hour dial, and 24-hour dials were only ever mandatory on Canadian railroad watches. That was not a thing that was enforced in the United States. So a bit of history about railroad watches. Pocket watches have been used on railroads almost since the dawn of railroads, and in those days there were no radios, there were no real methods of communication apart from maybe the telegraph and mechanical signals. So the way to keep trains safe and punctual was to keep them on time. And to do that, everyone who operated a train, so that was the fireman, the engineer, and the conductor, all had to carry the most accurate pocket watches that they could manufacture and purchase at the time. And the problem was there was no standardization. Any high-grade pocket watch would do. And for a while this worked, but the problem was that, like I said, there's no regulation, there's no central governing body looking after what was called railroad time, and this caused a lot of problems. In 1891, in Kipton, Ohio, in the United States, there was a massive train wreck, all because the conductor's pocket watch stopped for just, I think it was like 3 or 4 minutes. And stopping for just a couple of minutes was enough to cause a massive train wreck. And after that incident, the American government and eventually other governments around the world, the Canadian government, the British government, governments in Europe, and even in Australia, they all said that we have to nip this in the bud and we need to have proper railroad time and proper railroad pocket watches for our for our staff to use. And so they came up with a list of guidelines. And this watch, made in the 1950s, at the very tail end of the railroad pocket watch era, really epitomizes all of those guidelines. Now, you might look at this and think that it's just a regular pocket watch, and, well, you would be right. It is a pocket watch, but it's a pocket watch with several features. And I will show you what they are now. By the early 20th century, the various governments of the world had come up with a list of regulations about what made a railroad standard pocket watch. And these were regulations and rules which everyone, absolutely everyone, had to follow. And you will find just about every single one of them on this watch, because this is a real honest-to-goodness railroad watch. So what are they? All right. Every pocket watch had to have at least 17 jewels in the movement. Jewels were there to reduce friction and improve timekeeping. Now, this is the back of my watch, and this has a 21 jewel movement. It also had to have position adjustments, meaning that the watch would keep position no matter, it would keep time no matter what position it was in. There were 6 positions, so that was crown up, crown left, crown right, dial up and dial down. I think there were probably a couple more which I've forgotten. But basically, the watch was expected to keep time in every single position that it could find itself in, sitting in a man's pocket. On top of that, watches had to be adjusted for temperature variance from, I think it was 34 degrees Fahrenheit up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. On top of that, watches also had to be calibrated for isochronism. Isochronism is the variation in timekeeping caused by the tension in the mainspring. When a watch is fully wound, it runs slightly faster. When a watch mainspring has wound down, it runs a bit slower, and so you had to adjust the watch accordingly to keep time between those two extremes. Okay, apart from that, what other features were there? Every railroad pocket watch had to have bold Arabic numerals like this. You could not have a railroad standard pocket watch with Roman numerals, because in the dark, on a rocking, rolling train traveling at 60, 70, 80, 90 miles an hour, you had to be able to look at your watch in a second and be able to tell the time. On top of that, you had to have clear markings around the edge of the dial, which is why these are so bold here, so that you could tell exactly what time it was right down to the minute. Every railroad watch had to have large, bold hands, which you could see easily. These particular hands, as you can see, are blue steel. Blue steel was a very common feature on antique pocket watches, also on antique railroad watches like this. Steel in those days was not good, it would rust, and so to prevent it from rusting, they would heat treat it. And the heat treatment caused the hands to turn a very dark navy blue purple sort of color, and most of the time you won't notice it, but if you hold it, if you catch the light just right, you can see that the hands are actually very, very dark blue. And there we are. What other features did a railroad pocket watch have to have? One of the biggest distinguishing features was that the watch had to be lever set. With most pocket watches, you would fold down the bow at the top, you would pull out the crown, and you would set the time, pop the crown back in, wind it up, and head on your way. You cannot do that with this. The reason for that is because if this is sitting in your pocket and it bumps into a coin or whatever, and the coin pushes up the crown, then the watch could be set to an incorrect time, and that was a safety risk. The whole reason these watches existed was to improve safety. Safety of the trains, safety of the crews, safety of the passengers. So, to prevent that from happening, every watch had to be what was called lever set. So that means to set the watch, you had to unscrew this, take it off, and you had to pull out the setting lever, which is right in there. Now you could turn the crown and set the time. Then you pop it back in, and you would pop this back on top. Now there were very, very strict regulations about railroad time. Every railroad pocket watch had to keep time to plus or minus 30 seconds a week, or plus or minus 5 seconds a day. And if you were an employee of the railroad, if you were a conductor, for example, you could go to a watch shop and you could buy your pocket watch. You could buy you could buy the movement and you could buy the case, because in those days watches and cases were sold separately. You would buy the movement and then you would decide what case you wanted the movement to go into. And so what happened was that you could buy a really nice gold case or a really nice silver case. This particular case is gold filled, and then you would just put the movement inside, and that was where your interference with the watch ended. The only thing that you were allowed to do after that was to wind the watch and to read the time. If you were a railroad conductor, if you were an engineer, if you were a station master, if you were a fireman, you were not allowed to tinker with the watch. You were not allowed to regulate it yourself. You were not allowed even to set the time. If you woke up one morning and realized that your watch had run down during the night and you forgot to wind it, you couldn't just take it to the kitchen, look at the kitchen clock, set the time and wind the watch. You would have to take this to a certified railroad watchmaker, and he would set the time for you according to the master clock at the station, which was regulated by telegraph from the nearest observatory. So yeah, there were very, very strict rules about how you could use these, what you would use them for, and how they had to be maintained. And this lasted right from about the 1880s, 1890s, all the way up to the end of the 1950s. So, yeah, this is really, it is a piece of history. I mean, the 1950s was the end of watches like this, and it's amazing that they even lasted that long. But yeah, before quartz watches came along, before the modern battery watch, these watches were among the most accurate that you could buy. And you could go into a watch shop and you could buy one of these. You didn't have to work for the railroads to own one of these. But if you worked for the railroads, then you did have to have one. And they used to sell railroad grade and railroad standard. And there is a difference. Railroad standard means that it is a watch that you use on the railroads. Railroad grade means that it is up to that standard, but that various features of that watch would mean it couldn't be used on the railroad. For example, it might have all these features, but it might be a hunter case watch with a lid that goes over the dial. And you couldn't have that on a railroad watch. So, yeah. They are highly, highly collectible watches. I have just this one, and I highly doubt that I would ever be able to get another one, but yeah, there we have it. Just a little bit of railroading history and a little bit of horological history for you. And there we have it. If you want to find out more about antique pocket watches, a subject which I am very passionate about, then you can go to my blog. The link is in the description below, and you can have a look around and see what I've written about the subject, and also the other topics which I have written about in the past. Thank you very much for watching.